guess before we get started, too, what is some of your experience with acrylic painting?
Not too much. My daughter, she's coming in here. She lives here. I'll introduce you. This is our daughter, Katie. That's Jennifer.
Hi,
And
Katie.
she lives about in Littleton, which is about a half an hour away from Uncle John and Aunt Shannon.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So these are Katie. Katie actually is really good at art. So
Oh, that's awesome.
I'm not very good at art, but I like to learn the basics of acrylic. So we have all our supplies from Michael's, like your standard colors.
Cool.
And that masking tape, and we've got some brushes, and I don't know if you can see this little palette. And
I think you have to turn your video on for me to see you.
Let's see. How do I do this? Oh, start video. How about
there we
this?
go. Now I can see you.
Okay. So, and we've got some mixed media, like, you know, booklets.
Beautiful. Cool.
And brushes and, you know, things like that. And we've just been kind of looking at different tutorials, but I like to really hear the basics from an expert, such as
Perfect. Well, that sounds awesome. It looks like you've got some really good things. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those supplies and recommendations, and from what you've held up, it looks like you've picked some really good things already, which is awesome. And then kind of at the end of this, which I'll get to, I guess I've got my little, I'll just kind of start going through this, I guess, because I do have it all in here. But I just always kind of start with, and it is just you and I today, so feel free to keep your mic on. That's totally fine. We can almost do this as more of a conversation if you'd like.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
That's totally fine. And like I said, feel free to ask questions. I'll make sure to allow time for questions, and at the end too, I'll have time for questions and answers. So basically, I'm here for you, to support you, to answer questions, to guide you. My kind of plan is to kind of talk about objectives and goals, go into my little presentation, the class for today, which involves supplies and materials, as well as some of my tips for success, especially this is geared for beginners and those starting out to feel more comfortable. And then I'm ending it with a project to start you on. And then my plan with the project is I'll be guiding you through the Element3 health homepage through videos and step-by-steps, and then we'll all get together at the end and kind of talk about the project and stuff. So I'll really be here to support you with that.
Great.
And then of course, questions and answers. So objectives and goals, of course, is just to learn about the materials and supplies needed for acrylic painting, as well as gaining some new knowledge that can help improve your painting skills. So essential acrylic painting supplies, which it looks like you already have some really good stuff, your acrylic paints and brushes, obviously surfaces to paint on. It looks like you've got some watercolor paper, which is awesome, a palette, which could be, you know, obviously something professional, could also be a plate, whatever you've got. I always like to keep, perfect, yeah. Rag and paper towels. And I would just say, like, I guess hopping back to the plate, I think just having something big enough to mix your colors on is really good. Like, you always see those little bubble palettes for what, like 99 cents, you know, at the craft stores. But what I find is there's no room to mix on there. So I like to have like a big, I actually use like a big butcher tray, which I'll show you on another slide, but like a big white plate or paper plate can work, or anything. But I like something that I can mix on and I can see the true color. So cup or jar of water, of course, and soap for cleanup. So one thing about acrylic paint, of course, it's a very versatile medium. It's also one of the least toxic as far as paint goes, if you're comparing it to like oil paint. The cool thing about it is it's water soluble, but when it dries, you know, you've probably noticed this as you've painted before, it almost has that kind of plasticky feeling on top. It's water resistant when it's dry, and then you can build up layers of that paint and you're not going to disturb anything underneath. And of course, some of the property is it dries very quickly too. So some of the surfaces of watercolor, red watercolor paper. Some of the surfaces I like to use, these are my primary surfaces I like to paint with acrylic. I would actually say watercolor paper is what I use most often, and also what I do recommend for beginners, because I think it's just really easy to use. It's just the right thickness. It holds the paint really well. I did label the 3 types of watercolor paper. You can use any of those types. I buy cold press a lot just because it's kind of middle of the road. I like a little texture, but if you're wanting something super duper smooth, you could go hot press. And of course, canvas, there's canvas panels. I'm sure you've seen those in stores. Canvas paper is really awesome. And you can even tape that to like a wood surface, and then you could like frame it with like a glass frame over, glass over top in that frame, which can be nice alternative than like a canvas. And then actually one of my personal favorite things to paint on is wood panel. I buy it at Michael's in like a 3-pack usually, but I love it. And the reason why is I just like smoother. I know I'm contradicting myself because I said I like cold press watercolor paper, but when it comes to like an actual panel, I just like the smoothness of the wood personally. And I feel like for beginners, oftentimes that's nice because you can truly play with the texture of the paint and you don't have to worry about working with a canvas and that texture that creates. So, just some things to consider.
Okay.
So these are some extra or really nice to have painting supplies, and I have all these things and also supply them to all my beginner students. And that's gesso, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Some type of easel, or if you don't have an easel, I think at the very least, if you had to like Home Depot or Lowe's and just get yourself like a masonite board to tape your watercolor paper to, it can be really awesome because then you can take that around with you, prop it on different surfaces, and an easel allows you to paint upright versus flat on a tabletop, and that can totally change the way you paint. I've had beginner students be like, oh my goodness, because for them, they just needed it propped. You can see it differently. You can work differently, use your muscle and your body differently. So that can be handy to have. Apron, of course. I always say, just kind of a side note, rubbing alcohol tends to get acrylic paint out of clothes, but I always just, disclaimer, traditionally speaking, acrylic paint stains, so aprons are nice. Palette knives are awesome. If you don't have palette knives, you could use popsicle sticks, or even like plastic knives can work just as well. Some kind of scraping tools, sponges, toothpicks. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but that can be nice if you're into adding texture.
Okay.
Masking tape, which you showed me you have already, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And then, of course, pencils or charcoal. Sometimes I'll draw my sketches out with charcoal on my canvas instead of pencil. That's just, a different way to do it. And then acrylic mediums, which I'm going to talk more about in just a little bit here. So gesso, I'll just kind of go over, because I am recording this as well, just so it's kind of on our event. But when you buy a canvas in a store, it's typically painted white already, right? And that's because it's already coated with gesso. So if you were to someday stretch your own canvas, let's say, build your own frame, buy your own canvas, that wouldn't be gessoed. So you can buy gesso and you can paint over top. And you can buy gesso, you can buy black gesso. You can also use gesso to prime. Sometimes artists will prime wood surfaces with gesso because they don't want wood grain to show through. I kind of like the wood grain, but you can use gesso. Or let's say you were going to paint a mural on a wall, you might prime gesso over it first. It's kind of like a primer, an acrylic primer.
Okay.
And then acrylic mediums, again, I'm going to talk more about those in a minute, but I did put this picture up here. This is a brand I really like that I buy for my beginner artists because it's very affordable, and it's just Blick. And you can go to blick.com, and that's just one brand I like because it's affordable and it's quality. Just some different easels at the bottom, and then these are some of the different scrapers that I was talking about that you can buy that are specifically art scrapers made for just different textures, blending, things like that.
Okay. I think we have a scraper.
Cool.
Oh wait, I think this?
Oh, that's a palette knife. Perfect.
Okay.
That is handy. You will want that for sure. So these are some of my favorite beginner things, but I will say I am not like a person who's like one brand and that's the only thing I swear by any means. What you showed me is all stuff I would have purchased myself and is good quality stuff. I just happen to, with my students, we use Liquitex Basics with them, but there's lots of other paint that's on par with that that's also really good, and you can mix and match your brands, obviously. So the tray you're seeing there, that's a image of the butcher tray that I use. I also have them for all of my students, and I love them because for about 15 to 20 bucks, if you're buying the big one, which I recommend, that's it. That is the only palette you'll need for the rest of your life, honestly. And it's so durable. You just pour hot water on the dry paint, peels right off. You're good to go. You see your colors because it's white, it's big. You've got the lipped edges. So if you did want to do watercolor or gouache with it, you could. You could even use oil on this too. So it's a really versatile palette. Actually, this little easel you're seeing, I just got myself this easel. It's a little box easel that you can sit on your tabletop. I just tape my paper right to it. Awesome. And then I put a little picture too of some washi tape. Masking tape is awesome. I use it all the time, but I have found that it'll rip my paper if I'm doing watercolor paper. So if you're doing watercolor paper, washi tape is really nice because it won't rip your paper. But if you're doing canvas or canvas paper or wood and you put masking tape on there, you're totally fine. It's not going to hurt it. And then I'm same with brushes. I honestly have so many different brushes. I have cheap craft brushes. I have little kids brushes. I have expensive watercolor brushes from art school. And you want to know what? I use all of them. So brushes are kind of a thing. I think shape is more important than anything, which I'll talk about in just a little bit.
Okay.
So it's just some acrylic painting tips for success. And I know you've been to my YouTube, of course. So I do have this video up there. It's also linked to the homepage on Element3 for our drawing and painting club. But this video will talk about the tips I'm going to be mentioning while also showing you some video demonstrations. So, but my talking in the video is a little bit more concise than what I'm doing here. So it's just kind of a nice balance if you want to see a little bit more in depth or see an actual physical example. This video is good to check out. So my first tip, this is, I think, the most important thing, and that's using quality paint. You know, when I was a high school student and I didn't have a lot of money to spend on art supplies, I would go to Hobby Lobby and I would buy those 50-cent craft paints, right? And I would do tons of paintings with them. And not that you can't, and craft paints are great for lots of things, but it's not true acrylic paint that's meant for painting in this way, and it dries a lot flatter. Whereas when you buy, I put 3 brands I use a lot, but again, there's other great brands besides these. These are just 3 I happen to have on hand right now I'm using. And that's Liquitex, whether that's the basics or the professional line is a little bit more pricey, but you know, if you do your coupons, which I usually do, you can get some decent deals, but the basics are awesome. Golden has great paint, Winsor & Newton, also great. But the biggest thing to know about acrylic paint is there's 2 components of it. You've got your pigment, your color, and then you've got your binder. Those are the 2 components. And when you have cheap paint, oftentimes the pigment just isn't as high quality. So you're getting, it's more translucent. It's just not as vibrant. Whereas if you get like that golden, like this, that yellow bottle, ooh, that is yellow straight from the jar. So it's going to make a big difference. The binder, so I'm going to talk about this in just a minute when actually it's my next slide, but I'm going to be talking about a wash. So you can water down your acrylic paint, but you don't want to water it down too much because you'll lose your binder. So I'll give you a solution for that in a little bit too. So it's just important to know that those are the 2 components of acrylic paint that makes it the acrylic paint. So I guess that turned out a little, supposed to be a whale. You can kind of see it. But So applying a wash. So what I mean by wash is, have you painted with watercolor paint before?
Dabbled a little bit.
Could you
Yeah.
imagine the consistency of it kind of spreading out on the paper at least if I,
Yes, a lot thinner, a lot thinner.
yes, a
It's
lot thinner.
more difficult than acrylics
Yes,
for
I
me.
would agree.
Mhm.
I agree. I think watercolor is way more challenging than acrylics is. I think acrylics is a great place to start for beginners for sure.
Okay.
Um, but so a wash is, and you can do this on watercolor paper, canvas. I even do it on wood, although you don't have to do it on wood. What it does is you're taking some acrylic paint and you're putting a little water in, say 25% water. And this is where you don't want to douse it with water because you don't want it to lose its binder. You don't want it to not actually adhere to the paper and be archival. So about 25% water, and you can do any color you want. The whale here, just you can see on the left, has a gray wash underneath the blue.
Mhm.
A lot of artists will underpaint with grays and keep things grays. Sometimes, for example, if I'm going to paint a red apple, I might want to wash the background green because red and green are complementary. So even though that green's not going to show, it gives a nice undertone for my painting. So you can do
Oh,
any
okay.
color you want. All it does is it's providing a middle value ground for you to work on. You're not working on black, you're not working on white, you're working on a middle ground. And because acrylic paint is made to be layered, it provides you a surface to begin layering on, and I guarantee you will notice a difference the first time you paint that way.
Mhm.
So brushes, I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about this. And like I said, I'm not too picky with my brands. Like I have plastic handled kids brushes that work amazing. It's more or less one considering short handle is typically made for if you're working on a tabletop surface and you're closer to your art versus long handled, typically made for easel work. Does it matter if you use opposite, mix and match? Of course not, you can. But that's traditionally what the length of the handle means, nothing else. The two most important brushes I would say to have are the two I listed first, flat and round. And you'll notice in the picture, they're also listed first. And that's because these two brushes are going to provide you with the most options, from thin lines to filling in large areas to blocking in big areas of color. Rounds and flats can accomplish that for you. However, I'll say if you look at the bright paintbrush, that's actually like one of my favorite paintbrushes. It looks similar to a flat, but it kind of rounds a little
Mhm.
bit at the edge. And then like the angle, I know our little icons are a little bit over that, but an angle's just like a flat, but an angle, you can get beautiful crisp lines. So, you showed me you have a variety of brushes. I think the best
Mhm.
thing you can do is just play around with those different brushes and try them on all their edges, see what they do if you have a little bit more water mixed in versus less water. You can get kind of textural effects with a dry brush versus if you're trying to get a nice crisp edge, you want to kind of wet your brush a little bit. So I'd say just really play, have a page open and just try all your brushes, maybe make some notes. Because I think when you take the time to do that and you're painting something, you're like, oh, I know what brush to use. And
Mhm.
that feels good when you're like, I need this one or I want this one versus looking at them thinking, I don't know, so play around with them, see what they can do, and that's a really good thing. And you did show me you had a palette knife.
Right.
So not that you can't mix colors with a brush, you totally can. Do I do that sometimes? Absolutely. But if you're mixing big areas of color, especially, mix with your palette knife. And all you need to do is just kind of scoop it back and forth. You're kind of scooping the paint up, spreading it down, scooping it up, spreading it down until it's all mixed together. And the reason why is you just grab your paper towel, you wipe off your palette knife, it's good to go. You use less paint. And perhaps you've noticed this or you will notice this, but paint bristles fill up with so much more paint than
Yeah.
we even realize, right? So you're
Yes.
wasting a lot when you mix your paint with your paint brushes versus a palette knife. So that's something that's really handy. So clean water often. This is kind of an easy tip, but something I think that, you know, beginners skip a lot. So don't forget to rinse out that water, get fresh water. Sometimes I'll have 2 cups of water, kind of my dirty cup and then my rinser cup, so I don't have to get up as often. So acrylic medium. So this is, I mentioned this a couple times. Acrylic mediums is something I think beginners often stay away from, which I think is sad because they're amazing and can totally transform your art. So what they are is acrylic mediums are made with similar properties as acrylic paint. So they're meant to be mixed in with your paint, and it changes the property of the paint. For example, there is acrylic mediums for adding texture. For example, there's modeling paste, there's gel medium. Gel medium is basically like clear acrylic paint. So when you mix it in with your paint, you get these awesome, cool textures, and it changes the way your paint looks, because it's like you're adding clear paint to a color, you know? And so it just kind of transforms it. It's really cool. You can buy acrylic mediums to slow the drying time of your acrylic paint to make it act a little bit more like oil. So if you find that you are really into blending and you want more realistic blends, but that acrylic paint is drying so fast and you can't get the blends the way you want, you can buy some medium to put in. You just mix it in with your paint and it'll just slow it down, so you've got more time to blend, more time to work. And when you're a beginner, that's really nice because you're learning and you don't have as much time and you don't know how to work as quickly yet. You can get mediums to make your paint thicker, to make it thinner. So when I say thinner, an example of that would be something called a gloss medium or a matte medium, depending on if you want, you know, a gloss finish or a flat finish. And so if you wanted a really transparent coat of acrylic paint, you could use a gloss medium or a matte medium to mix in with that paint so you don't lose any binder. That way, it'll still look like you mixed it with water, essentially. It'll give that same appearance, but it's going to be archival. It's going to stick to your canvas or whatever you're painting on. And it also can make more paint translucent, more opaque. There's a whole bunch of different ones. There's even one, this kind of white one with the kind of brownish little stringy looking things. That's a string medium. I actually just bought some for the first time and I'm going to do a little demo video on trying it out. So I'm really excited. I found it on clearance at Michael's. So there's tons of textures. So when mixing, always you want to start with your lighter color and slowly add in the darker color. You're going to use less paint this way and you're going to have way more control over your color. So you know, that seems like a basic thing, but I see it oftentimes. People take red and they're like, I'm going to make orange, and they add a bunch of yellow to it and they're like, it's still red, it's still red, it's still red. And then you use half your yellow and you're like, oh my goodness. So if you start with that yellow and slowly add the red in, you're going to have control over, first of all, what shade of orange you want, and you're going to use a lot less paint this way. So just kind of a helpful thing when you're mixing. And then complementary colors, I always like to mention, we always think, oh, if I want to darken something, I add black to it. I'm going to add black to it and darken it. And yeah, you can. That's how you make a shade. But I often darken with the complement. And again, I think you've got a lot more control and it brings more color into it. Black paint tends to flatten a color out. And so when you mix in a complement, you're leaving a lot of the color in there, and that can be really nice. So for example, let's say you wanted, you've got red and you wanted to make kind of a darker red, like maybe a burgundy, maroon color. If I take a smidgen of green and add that to my red, just a smidgen, I'm gonna get that color. But if I go more, and it'll lower the intensity of your color as well. But let's say I go more 50-50. If I go 50% green, 50% red, I'm gonna get brown. So you just wanna keep in mind when you're darkening with a complement, it's slight. You only need just a little bit there to do that.
A little at a time.
Little at a time, exactly.
Yep.
This is also just, just kind of an FYI, this is also referred to as a chromatic gray when you mix complements together. So limited color palette, I honestly think is the best way to start out. I know there's so many beautiful colors out there and like we want them all, but I think learning how to mix your own colors is so important because you're going to learn about color theory, you're going to learn how to control your colors, and you can make beautiful bright pinks and blacks and browns and all the colors you want with just these 5. That's all you need. And then as you start to learn more, then bring in some more. For example, I think this set I put a picture of happens to have green in there too. So it's got 5 instead of 6, which sometimes they'll throw a green in there, throw in something else. But, eventually then you can start bringing in more colors. And because, depending on how much you know about color theory, traditionally we learned red is a warm color, right? It's like fire. It's a hot color. But really you could have a cool red or a warm red, right? So we learn kind of more about color as we start to mix our own. But then as you get comfortable, you can start introducing more colors. Like when I look at my paint kit, I've got colors for days. But then sometimes I'll purposely pick a very limited color palette for myself. So but limited is a great way to start. Working in layers is super duper important. So these are the steps to acrylic painting. This is not what they will teach you if you go to like a sip and paint class. This is the true way to use acrylic paint. And when I say that, I mean all painting is awesome and I love any type of painting. But if you want to do like a true acrylic painting, like the masters, their process, this is how they paint. So they start with a wash. And I will, kind of a disclaimer, I will mention, you can draw, some artists don't draw their subject on their canvas, they just start painting. I always draw it out. That's just me. You can draw before you wash or after you wash. It really does not matter. I will say more often than not, though, I put my design on first. So my example I'm showing you is going to be an apple, so I'll just use that. So if I'm going to paint an apple, I would draw my apple, then I would wash, okay? Then I'm going to do something called block in, and I'm going to be teaching all of these steps, how to do them step by step in the through Element3 Health too. So blocking in is simply, imagine you were kind of looking at a sunset or a distant scene and you kind of squint your eyes at it. You know how it kind of gets blurry? Blocking in is sort of like that. It's sort of picking loosely where the colors are going to go, and if it's a light value or a dark value, that's it. I often tell people it's okay if it looks like a 3rd grader painted it during this phase. And in fact, mine often looks like a 3rd grader painted it at this phase because this is very stressful for people. They want it to be perfect right away. And so I just, it's kind of my way to hold your hand and be like, it's okay. We want it to look like a 3rd grader did it. And then we do a step called adjust or refine. This is sometimes referred to as an adjustment layer. And that's where we now start to refine that shape. So if I've blocked in my apple, now I just want to make sure everything is where I want it to be before I start to make things really permanent with fine details. Then we add any texture, which depending on your painting could be a lot, could be a little. But you don't want to necessarily do texture in the beginning because you're going to cover it up. So that's why you want to work in this way. And then you finish with details. Again, I see a lot of beginners, they like to get out those teensy tiny little brushes and they start painting little details right away. And I'm like, oh, you guys, you're just going to cover those up. So kind of breaking it down this way will allow you paint very big and loose at first, and then you kind of hone in, and at the end, which is actually my favorite part, I love the little fine tuning stuff. That's when you're using those little tiny brushes and you're up close to it and you're putting in all those fine tuned little things to finish it up. So it's kind of the overall process. And I would say that's for anything you want to paint, whether it's an object, a person, an animal, a landscape. This is the basic structure and process. So if you would like to participate in this little activity, you can certainly find a picture anywhere you want, but I love the website unsplash.com because it's all royalty-free images and they're very kind of artsy and fun. So I just went to Unsplash and I searched apple. I'll show you the apple I picked in case you want to do the same one and follow along with me, but go ahead and pick anything. I would say maybe try to keep it an object so we can just focus on the process for now. And then you can expand this to anything you wanted to paint. And then if you have access to a printer, you could print it. But if you don't have access to a printer, you could save it on your computer. You could save it on your phone, as long as you have the ability to reference it as you need.
Let's see.
So this is the picture I picked. And I'm not saying I'm going to make my painting look identical to this by any means, but I'm going to start it with this shape of this apple. So I'm going to be using just red, yellow, blue, black, and white acrylic paint. So just 5 colors for this project. I'm going to do my project on watercolor paper and cold press, which is like that medium bumpiness. I've got my notebook right here. So this is, mine's 7 inches by 10 inches, so it's not going to be super huge. And so what I'm going to do, there's kind of 2 ways you could get started with this, which I mentioned. So kind of gathering your supplies. I will be posting a list of the supplies on the homepage, so you can have access to that. Select your surface you want to work on. Like I mentioned, I'm going to use watercolor paper for this, but it could be on anything you want. Steps are the same. Depending on how you feel, if you feel comfortable freehand sketching, you can. If you're not comfortable with that, and you do have a printer, I'm going to post a tutorial on how to transfer it to watercolor paper.
Okay.
So basically, do you have a printer at home?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so let's say, for example, you print an apple. If you take that page with the apple on it and you take a pencil, like just a wooden pencil, and shade the entire back of the paper, and then lay it down on your watercolor paper and trace it with a pencil, it'll transfer on there. Does that make sense?
Oh. You print it out on paper?
Let me see if I've got like a little something I could show you. Okay, can you see this? This is like a picture of a dinosaur.
Yeah.
Okay. So I printed this. And so if I took, this is a mechanical, I took like a wooden pencil, and I would just take the back and I just shade the whole thing. Just shade it. I'll even do just a little bit so you can see. So I do about like that, but over the whole image.
Okay.
And then if you take your watercolor paper and you open it to a blank page, take a little piece of masking tape and just tape your picture down like this, and then just trace it. And the pressure of you tracing it will cause the graphite on the back to be pushed to your paper.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So you don't have to freehand it. Because, you know, a lot of times people who enjoy painting aren't drawers. They don't want to draw something elaborately before they paint. So that's kind of a trick. I actually show my students that as well, as a way to put something on paper. I'll post a little video on how to do that and post it on my little blog homepage as well. So that way, if you're like, I'm not sure, then I'm gonna document all of my steps, because I kind of want to chunk it because it can seem a little overwhelming, but then I want to just kind of do this so you know, people feel comfortable with the steps and I can be there to support them. So yeah, I'll post a tutorial on how to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And then, yeah, you'll be ready for the upcoming demos. So for now, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm not familiar with the paper, like the difference between, if you can go over again, the hot press, cold press, and rough. Versus canvas paper, which is
Yes.
best to use, because I thought for acrylics you had to get acrylic paper and stay away from the watercolor paper, and I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah.
Okay.
Watercolor paper. So the difference between watercolor paper and canvas, I guess, is kind of how it absorbs the water, you could say. Because if you took watercolor paper and attempted to paint that on canvas paper, it wouldn't adhere to it because it
Right.
doesn't quite absorb it. So that's kind of the primary difference between those two. But yeah, watercolor paper is basically just really nice, thick, absorbent paper. Because truly with acrylic, you could paint on cardstock, you could paint on something called Bristol board, you could paint on something called mixed media paper. Because what you'll notice, mixed media, perfect. Yep, you can do that. So what you'll notice is most notebooks, I'm gonna make it so I can see me too, that way I know if I'm showing it to you. Right here, there's a weight, and your notebook probably has a weight on it too. The higher the number, the thicker the paper.
Gotcha.
So thick paper is just good because it holds the weight of the paint. And acrylic paint, when you work in the way I'm describing, you know, imagine if you paint on watercolor paper, it's gonna be a lot heavier when you're done with your painting, right? Than when you start with it. So having a heavier weight helps hold your painting. And then as far as canvas paper is basically like canvas that's not stretched, and you could basically frame it, because it's traditionally how you want to present it a lot of time too. That's how you choose, because canvas, a lot of times you just hang it on the wall. I mean, sometimes people do frame their canvas, but you don't put glass over canvas, right? So sometimes people maybe want a painting where they do want glass over it, so maybe they're going to choose to do canvas paper. Canvas papers also, it's easier to maybe bring places, or like I said, you could tape it to a board or an easel and travel with it. You could roll it up. So it's just kind of a preference. I'm seeing if I have, this is in progress. I'm starting a horse, but this is the wood panel I was talking about. I get this from Michael's. This is 10 by 10. This is my favorite thing to paint on for acrylic. So it's meant for acrylic. This is the back of it. So it's like you could put a wire here or mount it or put it in a frame. So that's really nice. And then canvas, let's see. What I got here, this is kind of a bigger, it's a flamingo, but so this canvas is gallery wrapped, meaning it's thicker, and then there's some canvas where it's really thin. It's just a matter of preference. I just like gallery wrapped because I think it looks classy and I like it, and it's just what I like. But some people like the thinner one because, again, they want to push it into a frame or do something with it, so it just fits what they're choosing to do, I guess, more so. So as far as surfaces, it's really up to you, but I think in the beginning when you're practicing, using like a pad of paper like this is just good because it's more cost efficient. Canvas gets pricey, wood panels get pricey, and when you're practicing and you're learning, I think watercolor paper is great, and they still can make beautiful finished pieces that you can frame.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions about like surfaces, or did that answer it?
That answers that. That helps. Just if you could go over to apply a wash, because I'm not familiar with that. I thought you just get a piece of paper and you mix your colors and you paint. But you're saying to put some kind of you can create like a background tone. So you just put whatever color that you want.
Yes.
You mentioned like a gray tone, or is it very, very light and very thin? So and you let it dry, and then so it'll make, you said it'll make the colors pop, and then it's like a primer.
Yes.
Okay. All
If
right.
you, so on my YouTube channel at some point, if you go, I think I've got like a painting, there's like a little deer, like a fawn
Mhm.
painting, and there's one with a manatee. If you watch those, I start both of those off with a wash, and you
Okay.
will see. I think that will be helpful. And then I'll be making a video and talking about the wash as I'm doing it. And I'll not only talk about what I'm doing, but I'll talk about why I'm doing it.
Mhm.
And I'll just go ahead and mention it's okay to just start a painting. You can do that. It's not like, you know, you're gonna get in trouble or like the painting will be bad or turn out wrong. Not at all. I've done plenty of paintings. But I will say I can look at a painting and tell if it has a wash or not because of the way it's been built up. It's just, you can tell. And how many of the masters paint, they paint this way.
I I've noticed that a lot of the other YouTube tutorials, when I look at them, it's just plain. They don't
Yep.
they don't put a wash on it.
They
just
don't.
dab the paint and just create it. So that's
They
how
do.
I thought. That's how I thought. You know. So this makes sense to put
Yeah.
a background on primer
And again, not like what you're seeing on YouTube. It's not like you can't
Mhm.
do that. You can
Mhm.
totally do that. And you know, I'm not one of those types of artists that's like judgy about what other people do. I think it's great. I think it's just important to know the traditional process and why artists do it and what it's for. And then going forward, you can decide, do I want a wash in this painting, or maybe I don't for whatever reason. You know,
Well,
you can make those choices.
yeah, like we're near the beach. So if I want to get a background for a painting of the beach, I mean, if I use that gray, is it really going to add to it or take away from it?
So
If
something
I
like a
wasn't
gray
thinking.
that's a neutral,
Mhm.
I don't know, it definitely is not going to take away from it by any
Mhm.
means. You know, and like I grew up in Michigan, so I mean my beachy vibes are a little bit different than Florida, but like, you know, I think about some days you've got those really sunny days where the colors feel vibrant, and some days, or if you're out there in the morning, it feels more muted, right? So
Mhm.
what I would do deciding on a wash is I would say, what's the vibe of my painting? Is it bright and happy? Because if it is, maybe I'm gonna pick an orange wash, because with the blue sky and water, ooh, complimentary. That's gonna look
Oh,
awesome.
okay.
But
Yeah.
if I'm going with, you know, I just took a walk by the beach after a storm and it's kind of hazy, and I think a gray wash might be nice because it's just going to kind of set that nice tone. So you can pick your color. It can be any color you want. I've had students do these bright green washes that look awesome with pops of purple and blue on top. I often go complementary, or I think, do I want it warm or cool? That's usually what I do.
Okay.
My most common wash colors are probably red and blue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are you looking to paint a beach scene? Is that something you want to do?
Yeah, I'm interested in paying first and foremost just a simple flower. I mean,
Okay.
I'm really beginner,
Okay.
something very simple.
Okay.
And then see what happens, because I paint like not a third grader, like a first grader. So
Okay.
so and the old basic, something to start off that's very basic.
Okay, I love that. That
Mhm.
sounds awesome. So, and I asked you because, you know, our clubs, this is a brand new thing.
Mhm.
Just started, which, you know, is why it's very small. And it'll hopefully grow, but I love feedback because that helps me cater like future lessons. So if I'm like, okay, you want to learn how to paint a flower, I could do a little live class on acrylic flower, and
I
we
would
could
love that.
do a
Mhm.
simple, and that's something I could put together relatively soon. So like, I love this kind of feedback. If there's ever anything that pops into your mind, this is an ongoing project for me, and I will eventually have live classes every day, and it'll be ongoing throughout the year. So anything like you're like, this would be cool, I would love to know how to do this, like you can even email me, leave a comment on the blog, on my YouTube, whatever, and I can add it to my list and plan classes around those things, because
Okay.
that
Great.
would be awesome. We could totally do a flower.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Cool. Do you have any other questions?